Okay, so this is one of the more challenging teardowns of the rifles that I own. This is a Henry Big Boy in 44 Magnum, and I've been putting off doing this video until I felt a bit more familiarised with how it works, because often it has taken me an embarrassingly long time to put this particular rifle back together again after tearing it down. It's fortunately quite simple in terms of the tools that you need. You've got a couple of punches, flathead screwdriver, a small Allen key, and a pin hammer, and maybe the big hammer if there's certain parts that don't want to play ball. So to start, the basic field strip for simple cleaning of this rifle is removing the lever and removing the bolt. So to do that, I would recommend adding a little bit of electric tape to your flathead screwdriver to try and help protect the finish. An organised person might have done this before I press record, but there we are. And then we just start by removing the screw that holds in the underlever. That comes out nice and easy. And then the underlever comes out from the bolt carrier and the slot into the bolt. And then by pulling the hammer down at the rear, the bolt slides out the back as well. Easy as that. So that gives you access to run a cleaning patch. Oh, sorry, and there's your extractor, which is also, or ejector rather, which is liable to fall out during this process. But that gives you clear access down into the barrel to do cleaning, and you can get in and do some light cleaning work with a cloth and some oil on the inside. When I bought this rifle, and I bought it second hand, the person who had it before assured me, oh yeah, clean it all the time. But what they meant was they took this out and then just kind of waggled a cloth in there. What I found on the inside is that with this being, well, potentially what I think is, this being the Henry Big Boy Silver, you have an alloy receiver, a brass magazine tube, and a folded steel magazine tube housing, and it meant that there was corrosion where those three different metals met here. Now that could have been down to oil, but I found that, you know, since I've been stripping it down and cleaning it, that same corrosion pattern has happened. So I'm not sure if it's a reaction of the different kinds of metal touching one another. I'm not a metallurgist, to add to the long list of things that I'm not, including a gunsmith, but that's my suspicion, and that's why I think it's valuable to take this rifle fully apart. So once we've got the basics removed, the next thing to remove is the stock, which is a very simple flat-headed bolt here. And once that's out, stock just slides off the back. One thing to remember if you've not done this before is that with an underlever rifle, the stock looks upside down. So when you come to put this back together, don't do what I did the first time I took it apart, not pay attention, and then be confused about why it doesn't go back on the way it looks like it should with the proto pistol grip on the bottom. Upside down, faces this way. You can take this end plate off, but there's literally just wood underneath. There's not a huge amount of necessity in taking that off. So now you have your hammer and mainspring. So the hammer assembly and the mainspring is here, and it's held in place by this retention piece. So the first thing to do to take pressure off of that mainspring, there is a small plunger here that is depressed normally when the lever is in place and at home. So to get the trigger to drop, you need to depress that in, pull the hammer down, pull the trigger, and the hammer will just gently ride forward like that. You can then try and remove this, but that's how you put it back together. That's not the way that I like to remove it, because there is still a lot of pressure on that spring. What I prefer to do is take these screws out and remove the hammer and the main spring assembly with all of that tension removed. So that will be the next part that I take off. These screws, in addition to being threaded screws, are also pins. So you see how long they are, and you might find that these get stuck, and it's worth having a punch on hand where you can drive them through from behind. When you're putting the rifle back together, having a punch available to kind of move the internals out of the way to leave a gap for these pins to go in is also helpful, as you might see when we put the rifle back together. So then remove this second screw. So yeah, and this one hasn't come clear as easily, so I'm just going to take this punch and just drive that screw clear. Okay, and now what is holding the rifle assembly together is this small screw here and this screw, which is retaining the trigger plate. So I will remove the small screw. And when you're putting the rifle back together, it's worth remembering that the smallest of the screws that go into the main assembly is the one that sits in that right hand side. Now the trigger plate screw comes away, and the second shortest screw, or second smallest screw rather, is the one that retains the trigger plate. Pop the rifle on its side, and then the trigger plate contains all of the trigger mechanism. So there are some springs and whatnot in here, and usually I try to avoid messing around with springs. There is a couple of points on this plate that are likely to come loose or to drop out. There is a small pin here, which isn't held in place by anything. It's part of the retaining assembly for when the lever locks back into place, but there's no positive retention holding it in place as part of the trigger assembly. So it's worth taking that out because you may lose it. And this hairspring clip here drops out as well, and this clip is part of how the trigger mechanism functions. So it's worth just remembering where that slots into in this assembly in case it drops out at a later date. In case it drops out when you're trying to piece it back together, because it can be difficult to piece these back together. So then the next thing, we're just going to remove the hammer and mainspring assembly and pop those to one side. We have our mainspring and hammer retention piece, which also moves to one side. We then have our locking block. And again, when you're putting this back together, it's important that your bolt assembly, which I'll just drop out here, your bolt assembly goes back in above the cutout that's here, and not that you allow it to fall below into the portion of the receiver where the bolt should come out, because that can happen. And if it does, you may not notice it until right at the end when you go to put the bolt back in, and then you have to take the whole thing apart again. So a good way to check that that has correctly gone back into place is that this locking block should have spring tension against the bolt carrier. So as you can see, this one doesn't. So you know that your bolt carrier is in the wrong place. Whereas if your bolt carrier is dropped in on the correct side of the receiver, your locking block bounces. So that's just a helpful tip to save you a lot of rework during the reassembly process. So that is everything from the firing mechanism out of the main receiver. Just going to clear some space. So then we move on to removing the handguard and the magazine tube. So the handguard is a simple straight screw. Which feeds through into the barrel band. Just a long skinny screw that feeds through both sides of the barrel band. And then to remove that, it's a good idea to just remove the magazine tube. As you might be able to see, I've cleaned this up quite a lot, but there is still some slight blue brass corrosion from where this was corroded when I first got it. Okay, and then drifting out the front sight, on my rifle at least, is incredibly difficult, if not impossible. I can't get it to shift, and the amount of tension or power it would require is more than I'm willing to risk putting through. So to get the handguard to slide off, it's a lot easier to remove the magazine housing first, because then you have the ability to just lift the barrel band over the receiver and then everything can fall away nice and cleanly. So what we will do next is remove the grub screw that is holding in our magazine tube. Just pop that away in there. And then there is a pin that's holding the magazine tube housing ring in place, and it's dovetailed into the bottom of the barrel. So we just need to knock that out. There we go, and that's the second of your pins that you'll want to keep a track of in your parts box. And then you'll see that the magazine housing tube is now loose and can just be slid out the front of that retaining ring and be set to one side. And then that leaves us space to pull forward our handguard, pull the barrel band forward and just snake it over the ring, over the front sight, and then the handguard just drops free like that. You can remove the rear sight if you want to, but that's not necessary for deep cleaning, so I leave it alone. You can drift out this ring if you're worried about corrosion having gotten in underneath the magazine housing retention ring, but again, not entirely necessary. But there you have a fully stripped down Henry Big Boy receiver in the perfect condition to give it a full and thorough deep clean. And in the next video I'll put it all back together.